Certainly.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to All Natural All the Time. Hopefully some more will join us, but
You have home church TV up and running?
I can do that. I can do that.
Well, no, I mean, you've got to actually start the broadcast.
Yeah, I'm starting it now.
Laura, that would be great. So did you already have it up and running?
Yeah, I just started it.
Oh, you did? Okay.
But you go ahead and monitor, Laura. He
Okay.
really can't. He's got to do the presenting. And I'm going to do the follow-up phone calling. So see you guys in a few.
Yeah, so Doc will be rounding people up. Anyhow, let's go ahead and bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, thank you for all your many blessings. There's always something that we can thank you for, and some kind of way that we can praise you. You take such good care of us. But you know, sometimes we aren't armed with what we need to make good decisions in our life concerning our health. And so be with us tonight as we listen to the video and other information that is being going to be presented. And may it be, the information be of great benefit to everyone, but most especially those that are affected by what we're going to be talking about. Thank you for being with us, and help be with those that could not make it, as well as those of us that are here. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, let me share my, well, let me get the stuff up here and then share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Nope. I can refresh mine to see it. I can.
I've been hearing just about every day, I guess this month is Stroke Awareness Month, or Prevention Month, because I've been hearing this fast a lot. Okay. And it's an acronym for FACE: uneven smile, facial droopiness, numbness, and vision disturbance. A, arm and leg weakness, numbness, difficulty walking. S, speech, slurred, inappropriate words, mute, can't talk. T, time. Realize that time is critical. If you notice any of the above symptoms, immediately call 911. Studies show that you get the faster you get care, if you arrive at the hospital in an ambulance, than if someone drives you. With strokes, time lost is brain lost. Simple as that. But there are many ways in which we can prevent strokes, and you know, do it naturally, of course. And to kind of help us out with that, I've got a video here that to show everyone. Now it's a matter of finding it again. Oh, I think that, yeah, there it is. I don't, of course, agree with every thing here, but you know, well, I'm going to pause it there for a minute. You know, of course, when it comes to any kind of use of anything related to alcohol or other, you know, meat and that kind of thing, just doesn't compute here. There's too much evidence to show that that is all stuff that helps to raise the risk of stroke and or heart disease and other things. So, you know, it's yes, there's a lot of this that's been done in moderation. You know, the portion of meat and the portion of alcohol and in the form of red wine and all that is very little, but here again, not recommended, and especially for certain people. I mean, that more people are susceptible to addictions and other problems, even with a minimal amount.
Lyle, not seeing your screen anymore.
Okay, well, I'm getting ready to play the video. It should be showing. Can you see the video or hear the video?
No.
No.
No, Joe says she can't either.
Well, video sharing in progress. Why is it not?
Show screen.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, first you got to show screen.
Well, that's what I
Then you-
was doing earlier, and I don't know
Now,
why
there
it
it-
stopped.
It's up now.
Well, yeah, but the video isn't.
No. And
Yeah,
you're-
see, it clicks off every time. It shuts the screen off. Ay, ay, ay. What is going on here? That should not be falling down. And this should be playing. But as soon as I put open, it shuts the screen sharing off. Oh boy, oh boy. Oh, this. Yep. Every time I hit the open button, it stops the screen sharing. Can anybody hear the video?
No.
Okay. Oh, what is going on? Okay. Yep, it shuts it off as soon as I do that.
Let me try. Let's see what happens.
Okay, well, let me... shoot. Let's see. Let me get the name of the Healthy Stroke Prevention.
Looks like Garfield just got on.
Okay. Let me see here. Optimization.
What's going on, guys? Hello?
Lyle's having some difficulty broadcasting his video, but we'll get it going in just a minute. Thanks for joining us, buddy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for thanking me.
Hi. Okay, well, here's one that's a non-pharmacological approach. And
Echo, 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 echo.
Okay, this is the one. Okay. And
That's called the self-fulfilling prophecy.
okay, I'm going to put it here in the chat. I don't know why. Okay, you are the presenter. There's your screen.
Are you able to hear that and see that, everybody?
I'm able to see it but not hear it.
I can't hear it, and Home Church doesn't hear it.
I'm broadcasting now, Joe.
It's not playing.
Well, I turned it off. Try it again.
Raleigh Hospital Community.
Oh, now we hear
There
it.
you go.
Now we hear it.
Put your hands together tonight and welcome Dr. Paul Peterson.
Thank you. Well, they told me they were going to try to fit 100 people into the cancer center classroom, and I didn't realize this was the classroom they were talking about. Normally, we don't have 100 people in this room ever. So if we get more attendees walking in, we'll try to accommodate them, but I was surprised that when I was told we could get 100 people in here. What I'm going to talk about tonight is actually going to cover a wide range of topics, but I'm going to try to stick to just a couple of those areas in detail. So we're going to talk about what I think is more important than some of the things that we sometimes talk about in stroke, and that's trying to prevent them from happening in the first place. Many times when I'm on call for a 7-day stretch at a time, we're admitting patients through the hospital that are having strokes on a daily basis. I only take call at Duke Raleigh Hospital, but we'll on average have 2 or 3 patients admitted here on any given day that would be having a stroke or had a stroke. And most of these patients have no idea how they could have prevented their stroke in the first place. So it's somewhat perplexing to me when we have such a wonderful healthcare system why we would have patients that seemingly have such disparate ideas about their own health and how they can prevent a problem that, as you'll soon learn as I go through the lecture, is for the most part preventable. So we're going to talk about nutritional factors for the most part, and then some other non-pharmacological approaches that you can use in terms of stroke prevention. I'm going to take just one slide to tell you what strokes are just to make sure everyone understands what I'm talking about. When we talk about stroke in neurology, we're talking about 2 types in general. Hemorrhagic, which means that there's bleeding that occurs within the brain parenchyma or in the substructures within the skull. So in this particular example, there's a hemorrhage. This is likely a hypertensive hemorrhage from a patient that had high blood pressure that was pre-existing, that was unknown or poorly treated or controlled. Subarachnoid hemorrhages are typically aneurysmal. This is a typical location for a common type of aneurysm that ruptures. Ischemic stroke, which is what I'm going to talk the most about, is the one that we frequently see. 83% of strokes on average are ischemic strokes. Most of them are comprised of 3 different mechanisms: atherosclerotic, embolic, and cryptogenic. They put lacunar in here, but lacunar to the neurologist basically has the same connotations as these other 2 types of strokes, because you can't assume the mechanism for a lacunar infarction is different than, say, an atherosclerotic infarction. It's just a different way it appears. So on imaging, we call small strokes lacunes if they're less than 5 millimeters, but they may have the same mechanism. It could be that you had a cardioembolism, so a clot formed in the heart and went to the brainstem and just happened to stick in a little arteriole there. So stroke's important because it's common. It's the 3rd leading cause of death in the U.S. There's it's actually higher than that now. So there's, at the time I put this slide together, there was 800,000 cases annually. It's a little bit higher now. It's the leading cause of adult disability in the United States. And at the time I put this slide together about a year ago, it was 6 million. Every 45 seconds, someone in the United States is suffering a stroke. And so just in the time that I'm going to give this lecture, an hour, you can imagine there's going to be a stroke. If you gave a lecture for 60 minutes, 60 strokes. And it kills twice as many women every year than breast cancer. And so it tends to be sort of looked at, and I think traditionally it was a disorder that we didn't have a lot to offer. But we do have a lot to offer because we can prevent a lot of these events from happening in the first place if we do the right things. More than 70% of all strokes are first strokes. So patients do have repeat strokes, but when they come into the system, usually they're much better taken care of them when they left than when they got into the system. We tend to now have guidelines so that when you're admitted to the hospital here, for example, there'll be a litany of things that we're going to run through determining stroke mechanism and discharge these patients with certain therapies as they leave the hospital, which have been shown to reduce risk of recurrent stroke assuming that the patient follows the guidelines and we get them the appropriate medications. This is the key statistic. You may not be able to see it all the way in the back, but up to 80% of these events are preventable. So 4 out of 5 patients that are having these ischemic strokes shouldn't probably be having the strokes to begin with if we were doing the proper things to prevent the strokes in the first place. So my goal in this talk is to talk about a couple of key things that you can do in detail that will enable you to take home a key factor in reducing your risk of stroke in the future. I've touched on some of this already. It's well known to be something that's common. But this is a slide, and I have another slide right after this. If you're following along in your notes, you'll see that. But at the time that this statistic was put together here in 2003, the total direct and indirect costs of stroke were $51 billion annually. So we refer to direct costs as what it costs to take care of you when you come into the hospital and we're doing things for you, prescribing medications and doing therapies. Indirect costs are you're out of work, you're not able to earn a living, you're drawing on insurance, and so on. For each stroke patient at the time that I put this together in 2003, the cost of the stroke event itself is $44,000 with the cost of lost productivity, which is about $30,000. The leading cause of individual bankruptcy in the United States right now is healthcare expenditures that far outstrip your ability to make them when you have something like a stroke occur. This is data as of 2009, so the direct costs have escalated, so now we're talking about a total of $70 billion. So going back to the last slide here, I've got to run through them again, I guess. So it's $51 billion in 2003, and now it's $70 billion. Now these are estimated costs, so they take aggregate hospital data. It may be that we're better at recording how we're treating patients and calling strokes more commonly than they're happening, but it's a huge discrepancy in information between just a 3-year time span. But as everyone can appreciate, it's a very expensive disease that we're treating. So it's important that if we can make a small reduction in strokes, that we try to do so to reduce costs overall to the system. When we talk about things that can lead to stroke, there's various factors. One factor group is non-modifiable risk factors, which means these are things that you can't do anything about. You can't change your age, your race, your sex, or your fact that you may have been born with a low birth weight, which puts people at risk for stroke. And you can't change genetic factors, at least not yet. Modifiable risk factors are the things that everyone should be doing or should attempt to do if they're able to do so to reduce their risk of stroke. And these are the typical things that most patients have heard about. Hypertension, having abnormal lipids, diabetes, the big 3. Number 1 modifiable risk factor is hypertension. Smoking, diet, physical inactivity, or getting patients to exercise, and obesity and body mass index. As I go through this talk, you're going to see that most of these things I consider interrelated. If we could just get people to do 3 things, which is follow a strict diet, exercise, and quit smoking, we would reduce the risk of stroke just with that about 70%. So that's a huge proportion of what we can do. So when you're talking about obesity, body mass index, it's really related to diet, physical activity. I think everybody understands those interrelationships. So doing a few things helps to reduce these other risk factors as well. Potentially modifiable risk factors are things that doctors seem to throw about sometimes, and we don't yet know that they're a risk factor, but they're an association. Some are well known, others are still being studied and being developed, such as metabolic syndrome, which I'll talk about later, drug abuse, cocaine, amphetamines, ephedra, which is why we're taking off the market as an herbal supplement, oral contraceptive use, higher estrogen dose birth control pills in the past were a concern, low-dose estrogen pills still somewhat of a concern, sleep apnea, migraines, inflammation, infection. Just as an example of an infection, they've isolated certain virus particles and bacterial particles out of plaques that reside in carotid arteries. So we're not quite certain if that's an epiphenomenon, meaning that that's there because the patient has the plaque to begin with, or if it's part of the whole inflammatory process that forms the plaque to begin with. So more women than men are dying from stroke. So you would think that, well, if they're all the similar factors, I mean, what's going on there? Some of it has to do with there's different risk factors in women than there are in men that are often overlooked. The most common thing is that women who are over a certain age and then smoke and then use estrogen oral contraceptives, they markedly increase the risk of stroke. And patients with migraines that have auras, that are women that use oral contraceptives and smoke, they increase their risk even higher than this. So you markedly increase your risk if you put certain risk factors together, and it just so happens that women tend to put some of those risk factors together for obvious reasons. So when you talk about, well, how important are each of these risk factors, I'm not going to go through this slide in too much detail, but we define what relative risks are, which means that a lower number here is a lower risk than a higher number. So hypertension is probably the most modifiable risk factor that we have, the most important. And we can reduce the risk about 40% if we treat it adequately. Smoking, it seems obvious that we just should never have people smoking, but they do. And so 50% of these patients, if we have them quit smoking within the year, have reduced their risk. It's not quite baseline, but if you stop smoking today and you wait 5 years, those patients' risk of stroke from that risk factor goes down to almost what it would be if they had never smoked. So it's never too late to quit smoking. I have a patient this week who comes in who's had stents put in his neck, his heart, and his legs, and he still continues to smoke. So it's just sort of, it seems absurd to me when we know that there's a risk factor we could be approaching, and he's just ambivalent about it. Diabetes, depending upon whether the risk factors you have, the type of diabetes, there's a variability in that risk. Asymptomatic hardening of the arteries in the neck doubles your risk depending upon the degree of the narrowing. So we frequently will find patients in the hospital that have this narrowing, and we can do procedures to treat stenosis, such as putting in stents now or clearing out the arteries with an endarterectomy. Ideally, you'd like to prevent those clots from getting in there in the first place and the arteries from clogging up with those plaques in the beginning. Some patients will develop heart rhythm disturbances, and those increase their risk of stroke through formation of clots that then exit the heart, that go into the brain. They can also go into the arms, the limbs, the organs. And we treat different patients can be treated with different medications, of course, but anticoagulation with warfarin or Coumadin, which was actually developed from a rat poison, actually enables us to reduce the risk of clotting as long as we keep them in a narrow window of anticoagulation. Aspirin can be given if they can't take that medication, warfarin. Cholesterol, lipids, things like that I'm going to get into a little detail. Depending upon what your levels are, you might actually increase your risk more the higher the level is. What's that? Hyperlipidemia? That's fats in your bloodstream. So I'll get to that. I'm actually going to talk about that in a lot of detail, but those would be things that would be cholesterol, and then what we now know is the bad cholesterol subfraction, which is low density lipoprotein, or LDL. And so we can lower those numbers with medications. They say 20 to 30% with statins, but there's actually good data now that in certain patients we can lower it up to 50%, which is why sometimes you don't get a lot of attention to diet, because we can only lower the cholesterol so far through dietary mechanisms, but you can do it much more profoundly when you give a medication. So patients often will revert back to medications because it's a simple fix both for the physician to prescribe and for the patient to begin to use. But these things don't happen in isolation, so you can avoid the medications altogether in certain circumstances. You can't change your genetics, but you can avoid it by following certain dietary guidelines as well as activity levels. The recommendations that are here, I've gone through some of this already, but there's guidelines for all these things. This is where the primary prevention of stroke should happen, but often fails. I can't tell you how many patients I have that have had a stroke that come into the office, their blood pressure is still elevated, and it just doesn't make sense. That's something that should be treated within several weeks. When we first have a patient with a stroke, we no longer lower their blood pressure in the hospital setting in the first few hours, because you actually need that pressure to perfuse the area that's still somewhat viable in terms of loss to a stroke and hasn't yet died. After a few days, though, your brain is going to downregulate your blood pressure to a degree, but it's almost always elevated. That's the number one thing we see. So medications to reduce blood pressure is the most powerful thing that we have in terms of pharmacology. So taking, say, Plavix, which is a blood thinner type medication, aspirin, they lower your risk for strokes. We're currently about 15 to 30%, depending upon the trial. If you lower the blood pressure significantly, you can markedly reduce even beyond that your risk of a recurrent stroke. So sometimes I tell patients, I'd rather have you take the blood pressure medicine than not take your aspirin, although I want you to take them both, Because if you're going to take one medicine, take the blood pressure pill. But of course, we're going to want you on a cocktail of medications, usually, to reduce multiple factors. I'm going to talk in detail in this lecture about diet, nutrition, and the physical activity aspects of it. 2 risk factors which just shouldn't happen are drug abuse and smoking, but they frequently do. I just read today in an article in North Carolina that they say that through the emergency department, of all the patients that come through there, 10% are there for drug overdoses, just in this state. So it's a significant problem, and it actually increases the risk of stroke with certain types of those drugs that are being used illicitly, methamphetamines, amphetamines, cocaine, and so on. I'm going to give you a number of resources here. I'm just going to roll through them. And if you have the packet, they should be in there. I added, I think, 1 or 2. You can find a lot of information on the American Stroke Association website, which is a subset of the American Heart Association. And, for example, the risk factors, they're described in detail here. There's a registration area so you can sign up and you get frequent emails. You can fill up your inbox if you want from all these sites, because they'll freely send you information. If you access these sites and you're trying to get information, there's actually numbers on most of these sites that you can call if you can't access all of the area or if you have a question, and they'll send you information if you can't get it off the internet. What's the relative importance of risk factors? In other words, let's just say that we treated your blood pressure, your cholesterol, and all those other things, and we have our armamentarium, and we routinely do those things. But are those really the things that we should be doing? So somebody finally asked that question in New Zealand, and they said, well, listen, what would be the best thing we could do to get the most bang for our buck if we had to do several things? Why are these people having these events? And most of the time it's due to these social conducts, which are behaviors, diet being the number 1, smoking and sedentary lifestyle being the 3 things that just sort of just shouldn't happen, that shouldn't exist, but is amazingly, they're actually more frequent than you would ever imagine now. Biological risk factors like hypercholesterolemia, they're only a subfraction of these patients. So these numbers don't add up to 100% because they're talking about in aggregate. If you took 100 patients, for example, 17 of them had hypercholesterolemia, whereas on the prior slide, 30% of them had a diet that wouldn't have been what we would optimally hope for. So patients will have a number of risk factors, and sometimes they overlap like we talked about before. Things we can't change that we sometimes see, air pollution, occupation. There's a limited amount of stuff that you're going to be able to do for those things. But I wouldn't spend any healthcare dollars there to any great degree. For the most part, what we need to be doing is the simple stuff. I'm going to go through in a minute a series of slides that's going to show you what's happened in the United States in the last 20 years or so. And it's just going to run itself. But to prepare you for that, I've put together a couple slides here. This one talks about obesity trends as sort of a defining what that means. So when I see patients in the office, I'm often getting their height and weight, and we're calculating what's called a body mass index, which is an important number for patients to know. There are some variability in terms of those numbers, but in aggregate, it's an important variable that every patient ought to know. But most of the time, I'm having to explain to the patients what we're getting that number for. They don't know what it is. There's easy to find calculators, of course, on the internet. In the clinic, we use a ready sheet that sort of just gives you the height and the weight. You just put them together, and it gives you the number. But there's a calculator, for example, at the National Heart, Lung, Brain Institute, where you can just put the numbers in there, hit the button to calculate it, and it pops out with your number there. There's also calculators so you can work backwards. You say, well, I weigh this much now, and I want to lose 50 pounds. What would my body index become? Or how can I get my body index to be lower? So there's ways you can calculate this out. Now, normal body mass index should be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25. If you're greater than 25 to 30, you're overweight. If you're 30 to 40, you're obese. And if you're over 40, you're considered what we used to call morbidly obese, but politically correct term now is just you're exceptionally obese. To me, it means the same thing. You're very overweight. And that's becoming a bigger problem as we move forward in time. But you take this measurement, and then you're going to look at this graph here. And this is going to, when I started, it's going to go every 2 seconds. These slides are going to click through, so I'm going to just tell you now so that you know that you can watch this. What we're going to look at in the bottom here, there's a legend, and it tells you the number or the percent of the population that's obese. There's white areas that would have no data. There's light blue, which would be less than 10, darker blue, 10 to 15, and then real dark navy blue, 15 to 20, and so on. So you get to over here, which over 30% of the state okay, is going to have obesity, which is greater than 30. So that includes extremely obese patients as well. So when I roll this, and it's going to go automatically, this U.S. map is going to go sequentially with the date. This is 1985. It's going to start in 1986. It's just going to roll through to the mid-2000s. And what you're going to see is something that's exceptionally amazing, I think.
Mm. Wow.
So you can see there's a definite problem here. There's a definite trend as we're getting more obese overall. And as this rolls through, it's going to pop off here in just a second and go to the next slide. That's Centers for Disease Control data. And so you may say, well, I don't know that I believe that information. I mean, how is that information acquired? Well, it's because states are reporting this. And there's other organizations like the American Obesity Association that took independently evaluated this data. So there's something called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey that periodically is given, sort of like the census, but to less people. And they follow these people along. What you're seeing in this graph, this is just one example of the graphs that you can find on their site, is an obesity prevalence trend from 1971 to 2000. This is age of these men in years. This is the year they took the survey, moving from the past to the most recent in the back. This is the prevalence. So everyone can see it's going up, not only as you move forward in time, but also in terms of the age group. So 60 to 74, it's amazing to me that 35% of those patients there would be considered obese. That's amazing to me. So that it used to be the opposite. Now it's changing. So a couple more pieces of information here, sort of just to show you some things. This is United States stroke death rate. It's a map that's sort of a conglomeration from 1991 to 1998 of the population over age 35 who has a stroke and dies. So the darker the box, the higher that number is. And so it sort of correlates with what you saw in that obesity trend map. If you were to put those two things side by side, the darker purple areas tend to be clustering patients having stroke. If you go into 2000 to 2006, you see this is what we call the stroke belt, which means that it's an area where we recognize that there's more strokes happening in other parts of the country. So they call it North Carolina because of the sort of way it connects to Tennessee, sort of the buckle of the stroke belt, if you would. But that actually is correlative to obesity data to a degree as well. It's not perfect, but it's close. If you just take North Carolina, and you're looking at stroke death rates from 1991 to 1998, again, there's clustering in certain areas. This happens to be where most of the population in North Carolina resides. At one point I had someone that mentioned in a meeting that I was giving the same type of talk to that happened to be where all the pig farms were, and that may be the case, I don't know. Now, as you move forward in time, you see there's a changing somewhat in those counties, but overall the areas still stay the same that were having strokes before. And this, I just got this today, so I had to add it, so this won't be in the handout. But this is percentage of North Carolina adults who are overweight or obese. The body mass index over 25 here. And in this particular graph, the red is actually the higher degree, and the lower numbers, the blue, are the lesser degree. So again, where the population tends to be, we see more problems with obesity. We also see more patients having strokes. How about diabetes? Looks the same, just about, right? So this is another type of map showing that the counties that have the top 2 quintiles, or in taking 5, breaking 100 into groups of 20 percentile, and putting those together, the top 2 of those, this is where you're seeing these patients with diabetes. Those counties that don't have a lot of patients that have diabetes and obesity, like California, where everybody's healthy and running in the sun, I guess, they don't have a lot of patients having this problem. This is another way to put that, sort of like the maps that I rolled through earlier. These maps are going forward in time, in this case from 1994 to 2008, showing that as we have patients more obese, more diabetes. So those two things, like I said at the very beginning of the lecture, they're correlative. You can't treat one without the other. If you take diabetic medication but you don't alter your diet, you're not exercising, it's not doing anyone any good. You can actually get off those medications if you do exercise and diet appropriately to the degree that most patients just aren't doing it. Why is that? Well, I pulled a couple of slides in here just to pique everyone's interest, but this was an interesting one to me, and they point out that obesity and high fructose corn syrup, which is something that now is made from corn, used to be that you can get fructose from natural occurring fruits, for example, but in the United States in sweeteners, this is manufactured almost exclusively from corn, and the average American is thought to actually consume 60 pounds of this per year in terms of the amount of material that they ingest. But as you can see, as we move forward from 1976 to 2000, we're looking over here at the pounds consumed, and we're looking here at the patients that have obesity. As we use more of this chemical, we're actually seeing a higher rate of obesity. And I'm going to have a slide here that's going to show you. Sometimes it's hidden in there, so it won't exactly tell you like it does here. It's high fructose corn syrup. It'll be labeled something else. It's still sort of a sugar that, while you can ingest it, and it's not in small quantities going to be harmful, in large quantities, it actually induces changes. For example, there's some data support that we can actually use high fructose corn syrup or these types of sugars to signal when our appetite sort of signaling cascade, when we're full and when we need to eat again. So if you give this type of compound to rats, for example, they'll continue to ingest it, and they don't shut their appetite off. So there's some data that's coming out that supports the same thing in human beings. So this is a study. I just pulled this off last night. So this is from 2010, this year. Metabolic effects of fructose and worldwide increase in obesity. And what they're showing here sort of correlates to what we saw with all those state maps earlier. As you go from the early 70s, we begin to use this compound in the manufacturing of foods, and we replace what was a naturally occurring sugar, sucrose. We see there's a large increase in the amount of calories not only consumed, but the amount of calories coming from what is sugar and added fats. So in 1970, the average American consumed about 2,200 calories. In 2006, it's now up to around 3,400 calories. And so we're not eating anything healthy down here anymore frequently. We're using these synthetic foods more frequently, which I think everyone can now see is leading to an increased rate of obesity, diabetes, and so on. So these are important things that we need to touch base on. And I don't know that in the time that I'm going to have allotted here, I'm actually going to be able to tell you everything that you need to know, obviously. But it ought to get you at least thinking about what's happening in terms of your diet and what you're eating and ingesting, because it plays a big part in your overall health in the long term. For example, I didn't include any pediatric information in here, but there's a graph now that shows the same type of thing in adults is happening in children. And so the biggest factor for children in terms of what they eat and what their dietary habits are, of course, are their parents. So it's important that when we take this information back, we're educating a younger population, because they've shown atherosclerotic plaques in autopsy on a 2-year-old child. So you begin to form these plaques in very young age. And I got a slide on that we'll go through in a little bit later. I thought this was another interesting factoid, should pique your interest as well. This is relative risk for patients to develop type 2 diabetes based on their sugar-sweetened soft drink consumption, with less than 1 of those canned drinks per month to greater than 1 per day. They've actually done adjustments. So they said, well, maybe it's not just the fact they're having that. Maybe they're also already diabetic, or they have these other factors. They account for that in a multivariate analysis. They actually take those factors and see, is this factor alone significant? And sure enough, it is. So if you drink sugar-sweetened soft drinks greater than 1 a day, you're almost doubling your odds, okay, and it's statistically significant, of developing type 2 diabetes. So this isn't even written in a publication yet. I just had to get it off the internet because it's published ahead of print. So it's brand new information. Nearly a third of the extra sugars we consume are from soft drinks. So if we just cut those things out, we would do a great service to the most people. I think it's education that we lack there. When I said earlier, sometimes they're hidden. You got to read these labels, and there could be a whole lecture just on how to read these dietary labels. I think in the UK and some parts of Eastern Europe, they're now using a red, green, and a yellow light or sticker on the can, which basically tells you red, you want to avoid it in your diet, green, go ahead and eat it type thing. But we make our labels a little bit more in depth and in detail, and a lot of people, quite frankly, never read what's on the labels, most of the stuff they eat. But if you look at them close enough to see that there's all these other terms for other things that are really sugars that your body doesn't really metabolize that well, but you need in some basal quantity. Some of these things are in natural occurring substances, honey, for example, being a prime example. So what can you do about that? You can limit your processed foods, avoid foods that contain the sugar, choose fresh fruit rather than fruit juice or fruit-flavored drinks that contain these additives. Choose fruit which is canned in its own juices instead of a heavy syrup. Anything that slips out of a container and sort of slots and slides along your counter is probably not good for you. Drink less soda. I just say don't drink any soda. And then don't allow sweetened beverages to replace milk, especially in children, because there's some data that they're drinking less natural substances, of course, now, and they're drinking these artificially flavored beverages. So the two things I'm going to hit on for the rest of this, almost invariably, are going to cover dietary factors, simple things you can do. There'll probably be a lot of questions about, well, can you give me a specific dietary recommendation? The answer there is going to be, I can't do it, because we need to know what we're trying to accomplish, what disorders you already have, what your other medical problems are, and so on. So the best person to give you this information would be either the primary physician, or alternatively, in my mind, probably better than the primary physician is a registered dietitian or nutritionist, someone who has the credentials to sit down with you, to take the detailed history that they need to, and then prescribe a diet for you. So prescription of a diet is something that's done by the dietitians. Yes? We have several of them in the hospital. So if I see a lot of sleep patients, for example. Most of those patients, if they're not already engaged in some sort of program, I at least query them and try to get them into a program where they can get educated on their diet, because we can cure their sleep apnea many times if they would just lose weight. Can't do it for everybody, but yeah, there's registered dietitians. There's a list of approved indications, for example, that insurers have that would tell you, you got this disorder, we'll cover the referral to the dietitian. There may be a co-payment, but I've not had any patients ever turned down by an insurance company to see a nutritionist, because they would much rather you be doing this than going in the hospital. And so would most of the people in here, I would imagine everybody, right? Physical activity we're going to talk about just a brief bit at the end. But before we had even penicillin, okay, this is the father of modern allopathic medicine in the United States, William Osler. And what he said was the desire to take medicine is perhaps the greatest feature which distinguishes man from animals. Now, there are animals that will eat certain substances because they'll derive some benefit from it, or they're using it sort of as a purgatory or a laxative, if you would. But humans make pills, and so we tend to focus a lot in allopathic medicine on pills because most of the visits tend to be compressed now, and we have less time to educate patients. If you look back at the original term doctor, what it really means is teacher. So doctors or physicians and other healthcare providers should be educating people on what they need to do, and you should ask a lot of questions about the medications that you're going to get. Actually, there's a lot of good medications out there, and some you need to be on. So there's a series of slides here. This one's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Talks about nutrition, talks about what you can do if you have certain types of disorders, but this thing just goes on and on forever. This one from the United States Department of Agriculture talks about food and nutrition, and they've actually developed a program that if you just go online, you can plug in things and actually get this information. So you can develop your pyramid, if you would, of what you need to do in terms of setting up a diet on this website. Move back to the pyramid, this sort of takes you to that, and it gives you all these different areas you can plug into. And you can look up every single type of food. You can look up every food product. You can do everything that you want on this website. You can spend all day on this website and then some and come out with a diet specifically tailored by age group, whether you're pregnant, breastfeeding, and so on. There's a whole body of literature out there, and all this stuff is free. American Dietetic Association is actually another one of the sites that's actually very good. The dietitians tend to use this site, of course, as one of their primary media. But here you can calculate your body mass index just like on these other sites. You can also look up and become more educated in terms of foods that you're going to ingest and so on. So there's a ton of things here, and you can sign up on almost every one of these to fill your inbox up with educational materials if you desire. U.S. Food and Drug Administration, responsible for determining what is food, what goes in it, what's allowed in it, and then what's not food, what's a nutritional supplement, what's a drug, pharmaceutical. They sort of regulate things to a degree. They're the ones that come up with food labeling. So you can learn all about the verbiage, for example, on these labels if you wanted to do so. And part of those labels, one of the problems that I see is that there's just so many of them, it's difficult. So that's why in Europe and other places, they make it simple. Just put a red or a green dot. It's either good or it's bad for you, or you want to avoid it altogether. Dietary Guidelines for Americans, 2005, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Agriculture. That is the basis for a lot of what I'm about to talk about. There is an organization called the Teaching Company where they sell box lectures on DVD and audio. And one of the ones that they have is Nutrition Made Clear, which I actually own this. But they're now it's $99 for this lecture series, which is 36 lectures, 30 minutes each lecture on DVD. And what the person that came up with this, Dr. Anding, did was give all the lectures that I wish I could give here, over several hours that I'm trying to give in an hour. And so the truth is that there's so much more information I can't possibly cover it, but this is just another resource. We're going to talk about minerals, fats, fish, fiber, whole grains, carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables, antioxidants. Then I'm going to go into detail to a degree to dietary patterns that you may want to institute if you're not already doing so, because these have been very well studied. One is the dietary approaches to the prevention of hypertension, traditional Mediterranean or prudent diet, which is one that I think there's some controversy about this, but the traditional diet in Crete in the 1970s and early 80s when they were doing these population-based surveys is actually one of the most powerful diets to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease that's out there if you can follow it to the letter. There's a modified Mediterranean diet, which means we're trying to make it more palatable to Americans. They actually found in that region, just as I showed you in these United States slides earlier, that as they went away from the diet, adopted a more Americanized diet, of course they all gained weight. And so that they are not getting the same benefit they would have gotten had they stayed with that. Vegetarian diets, I got one slide on that. This is a quote from Hippocrates, the father of overall modern medicine, if you would, I guess. 431 BC, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. So even long ago, when they didn't have a lot of medications, they recognized that you are what you eat. So basically, that's my point for tonight. Sodium, if you got one thing that you can cut out, sodium has got to be it. This is almost invariably processed or prepared foods, which are anything that comes in a box or anything you have to open and remove a plastic cover off of. It's usually going to be containing sodium. Now, we don't use millimoles in the United States. We still stick with milligrams. But in this particular study that they were doing in hypertension published in 1989, what they said, if you just take this intake and you lower it by 100 millimoles, which is a small amount to a degree, but it's actually a large amount of sodium if you convert that. But if you were to cut out a lot of sodium in patients 25 to 55 years and just follow them through that time, their systolic blood pressure across that span is less by just 9 millimeters mercury. Doesn't seem like it's a big number, right? But in a large population, it is a lot of reduction in blood pressure. And it corresponds so that when they reach 55, they reduce their mortality rate 16% for coronary heart disease, which is hardening of the arteries, 23% for stroke, and 13% for death from all causes. So just from this one thing alone, they reduce the risk of all of these common maladies significantly. And that's not even going down less than that, which would usually be what you want to do. You normally get sodium if you just eat natural foods in sufficient quantities. It's already there. You don't need to add it. The DASH sodium trial, so I talked about this DASH diet, and I'm going to get a little bit into it a little bit later. They found that really the most compelling thing about their diet is that when they used sodium measurements and actually pushed that as a primary goal, that was where the diet really seemed to shine. The patients had the most effective control of blood pressure. The biggest benefit, as it says here, and you probably can't read in the back, were those patients eating this DASH plan at the lowest sodium level, which is 1,500 milligrams a day. Now I'm going to show some slides. Just 1,500, just remember that number. Okay. Now sodium. In this New England Journal of Medicine article 2001, basically they took 412 Americans on a typical diet. It's the DASH diet, and they put them into 3 groups, those in high sodium, intermediate, and low. You just need to look at the graphs and see the less sodium you take in, the lower your blood pressure, both systolic and diastolic. Where do we get this sodium? 77%, like I said, is food processing, is processed foods. You got to cut processed foods out, and you significantly lower your sodium level from that alone. For example, this is just a sample label. I got it off Google on the internet just so I could have a sodium label. But you see this thing, if you read this thing, you see 440 milligrams. That's 19% of your recommended allowance. That's per serving. Okay, so I got a slide that illustrates what the difference between a serving and a portion is, because we sort of suffer in the U.S. from portion distortion. You can't go out to eat without them giving you a plate that's 5 times what it should be. Other forms of sodium are naturally occurring, like I said, in foods, but you can cut out adding at the table. You never need to do that. Add it during cooking, you might need to do a little bit of that, but you can cut out a significant proportion of it. Hypertension, if we just look at what the cost of just treating that disorder is, it's alone $50 billion annually. So it's almost as much as treating all the strokes, like I showed you earlier. In 2009, $70 billion, but if we just treated this disorder by itself, it's $50 billion. So this is an expensive disorder to treat, which is why, if you probably followed the news this last week or two, Pepsi, for example, announced it's going to lower the sodium in its I guess maybe all of its products, but for the most part, as far as I could determine, just a few of the products were mentioned. So just lowering that sodium is going to have a profound effect, since so many people eat these processed foods. I've already touched a little bit about this National Health Nutrition Survey. They found that only 34% of patients who knew they had high blood pressure actually had it controlled, which sort of follows what I told you earlier. Every day in the office, I'm hounding patients. You got to contact your primary doctor. We need to get your blood pressure down. Many times they'll chalk it up to white coat hypertension, meaning every time I come to the doctor's office, it's high. There's always some sort of an excuse, I guess, to say that I don't want to go back and get it treated. Sometimes we mismeasure that variable, of course. Who's usually measuring blood pressure? I'm surprised you go to the dentist, they're measuring your blood pressure, but it's usually the least educated person in the whole environment there that's measuring your blood pressure. They may be very well trained in the measurement, but it's the most mismeasured measurement in modern medicine. So when's the last time you saw a physician take a stethoscope and actually check it like that manually? You don't see it. We got machines. The machines are accurate as long as the cuff's placed appropriately, sized appropriately, taken in the proper circumstance. But even if you know you have high blood pressure, most patients are not controlling it. When we see patients with a stroke, 80% of those patients, they already knew they had high blood pressure. They just weren't treating it, or they weren't treating it all the way. So again, sort of that's what I see every day in a hospital when I see a stroke patient. This is an important slide, because it's often felt, well, I can't get my blood pressure down to 130/80 no matter how much I try. That's important, but what's more important is just lowering it. You can lower it. A small amount can have a profound effect in the long term. So if you start a systolic, which is the upper number of your blood pressure, at 115, which of course is less than recommended for most people anyway, right? And you take that and you figure out, well, if we increase it 20, what happens to the risk for stroke? It actually, the stroke mortality doubles. So even small reductions in the blood pressure have profound effects on dying from a stroke or even having a stroke to begin with. So getting these numbers down through time is the most important thing. They may vary during the day. Most patients that I see in my clinic for sleep apnea don't realize that there's a circadian variation of blood pressure, which means that in the morning it's the highest it's going to be the whole day, and at night it's the lowest it's going to be. So if you go to the doctor's office at 8 in the morning, your blood pressure, of course, is going to be higher than if you go, say, at 1 in the afternoon or 5 p.m. So the measurement needs to be taken at several different points, and it needs to be sort of averaged to give you the best idea of what you're going to need to do to treat it. Back to sodium. When they followed 13,355 Japanese men, and why did they do that? Because there's a part of the northern part of Japan where they have the highest sodium intake almost in the world, if not the world. But they said, what would we do if we take and lower their sodium? And they said, well, if we cut this down basically by 100 millimoles per day, which is several hundred milligrams, but this is already a large amount of sodium between these two. If you cut that down, you have a 57% lower total stroke mortality and a 70% lower ischemic stroke mortality. Total stroke, remember I told you there's other types of strokes besides those from clots and hardening of the arteries. Ischemic stroke is the ones that we see all the time. You can have a profound effect. You can lower the risk of dying from that 70% if you just cut the sodium intake down somewhat. So I told you earlier, remember the number. So if you convert 177 millimoles a day of sodium, that's roughly 4,000 milligrams a day of sodium. That's a humongous amount of sodium. The body only needs 500 milligrams a day. You don't need 4,000. The recommended daily allowance is less than 2,300 milligrams a day. Now, I don't know why there's a discrepancy there. I can't explain that. But if you look at the recommended daily allowance and you look at these food labels, that's where that 19% came on that food label. They're basically taking what the recommended daily allowance is, the amount in that food, and giving you what it actually amounts to in terms of a percent. Are we actually following these guidelines? By now, most people would probably say that, of course not, we're not doing that. If you look here, this is milligrams of sodium, and this is one of these studies from 1999 and 2000, following patients through all age groups through the continuum. The recommended intake here, of course, is this red bar. The only people that aren't ingesting more sodium than they should are younger children. Everyone else seems to be enamored of it. In some cases, almost doubling what the recommended daily allowance is. Again, most of this is due to processed foods, the typical current American diet. Potassium, another factor here. Whereas too much sodium is harmful, you need a little bit more potassium usually than you're getting. And so you get these sources from fruits, vegetables, poultry, fish, dairy products that are naturally occurring. You might need to take extra potassium if you're on a drug, for example, that lowers potassium because it causes your kidneys to sort of pee it out, if you would. But when you look at, if you look at 43,000 men, the highest potassium intake in those people where they surveyed them on their diet and calculated how much potassium they were getting, comparing to the extreme, okay, had a 38% lower risk of stroke. So you don't want to be potassium deficient. In fact, if you come to the hospital and you're having strokes and heart attacks and you have low potassium, we often give you more potassium as a tablet right then and there. Sometimes in the ICU, we got to put it in as an IV. We follow magnesium, potassium. People often wonder, why am I getting these bills for these daily labs? What are you doing with it? Hopefully, we're adjusting those variables like we should be. You're more at risk to have heart rhythm disturbances, for example, if we don't have that number correct. When they looked at 33 trials and they put it sort of in a big collaboration, they said, well, let's put all these trials together. What did that tell us? When they gave supplements to patients, they reduced the blood pressure across different races in patients with and without hypertension. So in other words, potassium of itself is a blood pressure medication. But I wouldn't advocate going out and just taking it because it can be toxic. In large dosages, for example, dialysis patients, it can cause cardiac standstill. So you got to keep the potassium balance well regulated, but your body's going to do that naturally. You don't need to take usually extra potassium or any of these other minerals unless we're doing something to cause you to excrete or get rid of them. Magnesium is found in green leafy vegetables, nuts, whole grain foods. Again, the higher the magnesium, the less your risk of stroke. Calcium, same thing. And so all of these trace minerals, if you just ate a balanced diet, you're going to get enough of, unless you have some problem that causes you not to. So you don't need to add these extra things in there. I often see patients that have a list of 38 medicines they're taking, 15 of them supplements, some of them pills like this. Many times there's a relatively reasonable reason to be doing it, but sometimes they're just taking them. So realize that even innocuous supplements and nutritional additions to your diet sometimes actually will affect you negatively. Sometimes you need them, but that's usually determined by a test. Fats. So I promised I would talk about cholesterol and fats. This chart in aggregate is comparing various dietary sources of fat. There's predominantly liquid fats, which is at room temperature out in the open, and then predominantly solid fats. Where it sort of is orange here, I guess, to a degree. It says low in saturated fat and no trans fats, as I'm going to get to in a minute. Those are what we call the bad sources of fat. Everybody needs a little bit of various types of fats. You just don't need too much. So certain things that are solid, like beef fat, hard margarine, butter, those things actually contain some of the negative chemicals. Why is that? Because the manufacturers want you to leave it on the shelf for longer so it doesn't spoil. So these things typically are created so that they last longer. In little bitty quantities, it's probably not going to hurt you, but in the long run, you just a lot of it, it's going to come back to get you. The things that you want is a balance between a small amount of saturated fat and monounsaturated fat with larger portions of polyunsaturated fats. What does it mean when it's saturated versus polyunsaturated? It's basically just talking about organic chemistry and carbon molecules on these structures. So you can make these, in fact, they can be constructed through synthetic means. So you can change it. For example, if you are eating from a fat fryer, but you don't change that oil and you keep using it over and over again because it's sort of a fat, you'll actually change the chemical configuration if you heat it up enough. So you want to, for that reason, change oil, for example. The trans fatty acids, you just need to look at the picture. Everybody identifies this as sort of junk food or things that you probably shouldn't be eating anyway, right? Saturated fats we tend to think of as somewhat safer. In some ways, they are, to a degree, necessary, but you don't need to eat a lot of them. Your body's going to get what it needs if you just eat a balanced diet. Trans fat, 40% of the food in the grocery store contains these chemicals. It's just sitting on the shelf. And again, it's manufactured so that it can stay fresh longer. And you might see it's called partially hydrogenated or some other such term, so that you may not recognize it, may not say it necessarily on certain things that it's trans fat, but with the current regulations, in California, for example, they're required to label that with trans fats. In other states, you may not have to label if it contains certain amount underneath that. But if you read the nutrition labels, they have it broken down, so it'll say trans fats, saturated fats, and so on, to a degree, depending upon where you're at. If you just look at the list of these foods, you recognize these are the kind of things that you all would probably recognize you don't need to be eating a lot of. But we do this all the time. You'll see, in my clinic, I've actually had patients come in there and they're eating out of a box of cookies. They've eaten half the box, just sitting there waiting, which is dozens of servings in certain examples. But that's a lot of calories. It's extra stuff they don't need. Again, portion distortion sort of gets up and catches you. Omega-3 fatty acids, it seems to be all the buzz. You can't go through Sam's Club, for example, in the pharmaceutical section without large bottles of omega-3 fatty acids. One thing that we don't know in a great way, although there is data supported now, is does taking those pills do the same thing if you get the natural foods? What I would tell you is every time you can go natural in a safe way, I would do it. But if you got to take the pills, go ahead and do so. Just realize that these things, they thin out your blood a little bit. So some patients, for example, they're told, stop your Plavix before we do your operation. But then they'll still take these medications. They're essentially medications in pill form, right? They act along with the aspirin, Plavix, and these other chemicals to thin out your blood to a degree. So they're actually somewhat of a blood thinner. That's one of their protective effects. So you actually can get these substances naturally through a variety of foods. In certain polyunsaturated fats I'm going to talk about, you don't make them, so you got to get them through the diet, right? So healthy fats are monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, unsaturated, same thing, right? They raise what we call the good cholesterol, which is called HDL, or high density, or they lower LDL, which is low density. So they're called H and L, and then there's VLDL. They've come up with all these terms because what it talks about is what these fat globules look like when we set your blood in the tube in the lab and let it separate out. So high density tends to shrink and low density tends to float. So if you got a high enough cholesterol, and some patients do, that's what we talk about sometimes. Their blood is so thick you can roll the fat globules and shake it and see them moving up and down just like in a dressing bottle for salad, right? So these things, you need both of them. But the HDL is actually going to be something that's good. The LDL is bad. That's what you need to know. We used to just measure total cholesterol. We're now measuring LDL. But we're even moving beyond that now to sub-fractions of these things. So you can get huge panels that list dozens of these fractions. But oftentimes what needs to happen is you just need to modify your diet. You're going to lower this to a degree. And some patients may still need medications. I've talked a little bit about monounsaturated fats, oils that are liquid. There's peanut, olive, avocados, olives, peanuts, other nuts. They lower blood pressure, trigger production of more of the good cholesterol. Omega-9 is a monounsaturated fat from flax, olive, and other sources. It's actually been shown to reduce heart disease. And it may have a component of reduction in breast cancer risk to a degree. Polyunsaturated fats, these are oils which remain liquid at room temperature when you set them in the refrigerator. So again, just the take-home message is if it's an oil and it's liquid, that's usually better for you than if it's a solid stick or canned substance. These are plant oils for the most part: safflower, sunflower, corn, soybean, sesame, cottonseed. There's two things, like I mentioned briefly just a moment ago, you can't make these things. You have to eat them or ingest them. One is omega-3, which we know lowers blood pressure, reduces your risk of heart attack and stroke, basically by that mechanism. It also makes the blood less likely to form clots, and it may have some protection against cardiac instability and heart rhythm disturbances. It lowers LDL and triglycerides and reduces the risk of heart disease. Omega-6, which is so named because it just has 3 more of these same molecules in a row, is another polyunsaturated fat which is found in vegetable oils. And the most common, the one that people frequently hear about, is linoleic acid. Make sure I got the light there. So it reduces effects of insulin, and it helps support the immune system. And most of these vegetable oils, for example, are high in omega-6 fats, and then there's other sources. So fats are found in natural products, and to a degree, the more natural your diet, the more balanced it is, the more likely it is you're getting what you need anyway. You may not necessarily need to take extra substances. So polyunsaturated fats, when you look for stroke, what you see is that for the most part, we haven't really studied it in stroke. All these fat things I've been talking about, we studied it in cardiovascular disease extensively. But because the two things have a similar pathophysiology, meaning that you have heart attacks and strokes for a similar reason, a lot of this stuff is going to apply. But it, quite frankly, hasn't been studied as much as it should, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture. There's just sort of a paucity of studies that occur related to diet. You can find certain things, though, with the linoleic acid, which I talked on briefly just a minute ago, where it actually has been, it predicts when you follow biomarkers of dietary intake, which are blood tests that we do, you're going to have a lower risk of stroke. And then alpha-linoleic acid intake is associated with a lower prevalence of these plaques in your neck arteries and lower carotid intima-medial thickness. That's a fancy term. That's a measurement we take when we're looking to see how much plaque you have in a certain location in your neck. We can measure it. So if we treat you with certain medications, and we go back a year or two later and you're taking those things and reducing your risk of stroke, we see the plaques shrink. Patients with sleep apnea, for example, if they use their device every night and we follow them, these plaques shrink even if they don't do anything else. So if you modify risk factors, you can shrink your plaques to a degree as long as they're not calcified, which happens as you get older, as I'll show you in a minute. This is an artery that's cut sort of in a cross-section. And what it's showing is these HDL, which is a good cholesterol, LDL particles, and these sort of antagonize one another. So the LDL gets put down, sort of follows the blood vessels and sticks in there. When it sticks in there, it's scavenged by HDL. So HDL comes by and picks it up and takes it away. If you don't have the proper ratio, that's when it gets out of whack. And so you'll actually begin to deposit more of this cholesterol in your arteries, and then it's hard to get it back out once it sort of forms these calcified plaques. This table here shows you how you can raise and lower each of these things, but you raise the HDL by doing all the things that we talked about, which is exercise, weight loss, stop smoking, medications, and you lower the LDL with the same thing, so it's a balancing mechanism. So you're always doing yourself a favor if you're balancing that ratio in the proper configuration. So as I mentioned a while back, when you look at autopsy data, for example, and in medical school, we had a 2-year-old already forming fatty streaks, which is these little LDL particles. They sort of just attach to the blood vessel, so it looks just like it sounds. It's a streak of fat. As these individuals age from the first decade to the 4th decade, you're seeing that you're putting these lipids into the vessels. Then you're forming a protective barrier there, and then you're having clots and strokes and heart attacks, which is why, unless you have a genetic disorder, you rarely see patients that are 10 having strokes from this mechanism. So there's other mechanisms of stroke, but this is 80% of the ischemic strokes to a degree. In some way, shape, or form, those patients have these lesions. They might also be forming clots in their heart, but if you can clear out this debris, then you can reduce the plaque burden and the narrowing of the arteries, and you're actually going to be better off. So anywhere along this continuum, until you get to here and you're having these events to a degree, and this is already fissured, these are platelets. This is why we give you aspirin, because once you get this big plaque, if it fractures, which it tends to do, you can turn your head and they can break them. If you do that, then your body thinks the blood vessel's cut open. So it's saying, well, I got to close that up. So it's put platelets on this area, which then stick. Well, they stick until something else comes along. and then the next thing you know, those things break off and they go up and they cause a stroke, or they go into a heart artery and cause a heart attack. You can break off the plaque. You can break off these lipid bundles. You can have these platelets break off. So sometimes patients say, well, I've been taking the aspirin, I had the stroke. Remember I told you earlier, you can be doing everything right and still have a problem. Because if one of these things breaks off, it's like a piece of paint. It just floats in the bloodstream until it sticks, and then there's no blood flow going to where it was supposed to go, and you have a heart attack, a stroke, and so on. Just a picture of a carotid artery. This is where we put the stent in and try to crush that plaque back against the wall under several atmospheres of pressure during these procedures. Doing the same thing when we do heart arteries. The stents are actually placed across these lesions, and it sort of just buttresses them open, just pressing the plaque down. So like that guy I was told you about earlier who continues to smoke, he's not doing himself any favors because he's continuing to lay down more of this plaque burden. So if you already have these problems, you obviously want to be doing things to reduce your risk, but you'd like it to never form to begin with. So dietary modification is key. Fish, I'm going to talk about this because it's one of the most impressive risk factor reducing agents for stroke that we've seen. So in this particular graph, what they're showing is fish servings in 100-gram increments per week, from none to 5 servings per week. And what it's showing is that if you had none, okay, so this is like a hockey stick. This line really should be going through here, because if you have no fish servings, we're going to assume your risk or change in your stroke rate is 0. But statistically what happens is it looks like a hockey stick. But if you had 4 servings of fish per week, okay, and I'm going to talk about different ways that you can have fish, right? But if you had 4 healthy fish servings per week, there's a 20% lower total risk of stroke in those patients than if they have no servings per week. That's primarily where the basis for these omega-3 fatty acid supplements and things tend to come from, because it's so profound that you can reduce your risk just from that one factor in your diet alone. Now, I've been asked before, well, what about mercury toxicity in fish and all these other things? Well, I can't do everything. I mean, we can't monitor all those things, but someone's actually trying to look right now in terms of fish if there is such a thing as significant mercury toxicity in certain populations. Most of the fish people are eating in supermarkets is actually farm-raised fish, which is a whole other topic of discussion, which may not be as healthy as you think it could be. But if you took fresh fish in appropriate areas that's not highly polluted with mercury, you're likely going to be safe. This aspect of this graph is going to show you here. So remember, I told you it depends upon what type of fish, how great your reduction in risk is. This is, again, servings per week, and the blue line, which is here, is more than 5. The purple line here is greater than 1. And this is tuna or other broiled or baked fish. This is survival free of stroke. So you start out, of course, all the patients are going to be free of stroke when they start out. But as you follow them out for 12 years, what you see is those patients, again, with 5 or more times per week tuna, other broiled or baked fish intake, have a lower risk of progression from dying of a stroke than those patients who have no intake. But it's not the same when you take fried fish. The graphs look like you're reducing your risk, and to a degree you are. But if you look at the actual data, what happens is that if you have these fried fish or fish sandwiches, it's 44% higher risk of stroke, okay, than tuna or other broiled or baked fish. So not all fish is created equal. So when you go to the grocery store in the container in the freezer section, which is boxed full of fish and other processed food, you're not actually going to be helping yourself as much as if you just had fresh fish that was prepared appropriately. Fiber, whole grains, and carbohydrates, a staple of most of the diets that you're going to need to consider if you're not already. These things are a problem now because we have processed foods which would strip these of their nutrients. So patients over the age of 60, for example, in the United States, about 20% of them are B12 deficient. Some of them quite, frankly can't absorb the B12, but most of them just aren't getting enough B12. So your diet may seem like it's got all of these nutrients, but it may actually not when you look at it in detail, because if it consists of a lot of processed foods, we're stripping those foods of their substances and chemicals that you need that your body would normally metabolize. These are going to be called refined carbohydrates and sugars. White rice and pasta made with white flour, those are examples of these things that frequently are used in diets at home. Interestingly, in stroke literature, dietary fiber from cereal, but not fruits and vegetable sources, predicts a lower risk of total stroke and ischemic stroke. So there is some data that if you eat a lot of fruit and vegetable servings, and that's one of the recommendations in the guidelines, that you're lowering your risk of stroke. You're still going to need to eat some of these other substances to get dietary fiber to a degree. But these dietary fibers predict a lower risk of total stroke and ischemic stroke. greater intake of refined carbohydrates, which has what we call a higher glycemic load, which means it gives you more of a burst, okay, of the sugar, is associated with higher stroke risk in patients who were overweight to begin with a 61% higher risk comparing the extremes of intake from very low to a highest intake. So there's a huge difference. So you don't want to add too many of these refined carbohydrates to your diet. Fruits and vegetables lower your blood pressure at risk of stroke. Multiple factors may be at work, and I think in the slides it was incorrect on one of them, but vitamins, antioxidants, and micronutrient substances in these foods are what's felt to help lower your risk of stroke. For one example, they took a large group of adults, pooled all of this information on these studies together, and they found that the individuals in the top fifth of the intake of fruit and vegetable servings, which is a lot, 10 servings a day, I don't know many people that eat these many servings, have a 31% lower risk of ischemic stroke compared with the lowest group, which was 2.5 servings a day. And so you can markedly reduce your risk, again, by implementing certain dietary changes. They're associated with lower risk of stroke, but sometimes patients will say, well, what if I just don't want to eat that many fruits and vegetables, or I'd rather just take these pills to get this nutrient. When we studied antioxidant supplements, vitamin E, and so on, in patients, what we found is that didn't do them any good. There was actually, at the end of the 90s and early 2000s, large trials with names like vitamins and stroke prevention. What they were trying to do is study these B vitamin combination tablets to see, would that actually reduce the risk of stroke? It didn't. And the reason is because those are not naturally occurring substances to a degree, we think. There's still ongoing banter between pro and con groups and stroke sort of literature. Who's going to come out on top, I don't know. But you'd much rather get these substances naturally rather than artificially. So don't spend your money on buying cans of supplements and bottles of pills. I'd rather you just get it in natural foods. Same thing happened when they combined additional supplements with these, vitamin C and selenium. No effect. 7 large trials found no vitamin E supplementation effect on non-fatal stroke or cardiovascular death. What's the DASH diet? Well, it's a pyramid. The lower portions you should have larger amounts of, the upper portions less amounts of. It's that simple. So this is one example of a diet. The DASH diet, as I mentioned earlier, mostly consists of fruits, vegetables, grains, and then as you move up, you get less of these substances. And at the very top, the pinnacle, so to speak, would be sweets, which they say limit to 5 per week. The average school-age child has at least that many a day. It seems that, you can't, they eat breakfast with these foods, they have lunch with these foods, and they come home and they have the same foods again, and they're snacking. So those foods tend to be more lopsided in terms of what they're getting than what they should be getting. I said I have a slide that shows the difference between serving size and portions. And sometimes you think, well, I'm just getting a little bit more of this, but you can have huge differences in the calorie amounts just from switching the size of these. And this is where, if you go to the fast food restaurant, sometimes they'll have these little brochures you can get that will show the intake that you would get if you had a typical serving, which they're required to sort of put together. You can ask for those if you would like them. You'll see that, it doesn't take long. If you just had this burger right here, this cheeseburger with these French fries, there are 990 calories, and the typical American just needs 2,200 a day, roughly 2,300, right? So just with a single meal, you're going to get almost half the caloric intake that you need, but it's going to be junk. You're not going to get the nutritional aspects that you really need. So on the right-hand side, it says, for example, a batch of grapes as a serving is about the size of a 60-watt light bulb. So oftentimes what you'll see is the serving portions, even at home, tend to be much larger, people going back for more, and that sort of contributes to even more caloric intake. When you have the DASH diet and you implement that, your effect on your blood pressure is equivalent to if I prescribe you an effective blood pressure pill to lower your blood pressure just from the diet alone. So you might actually be able to get off of some of your blood pressure pills just through changing your diet. This, of course, they say would likely reduce stroke incidence and mortality over time because it's not actually been studied, but if you follow the numbers for blood pressure trials, of course, it would predict that it's going to do that. But again, the greatest blood pressure reduction comes when you have low sodium in combination with the DASH diet. Metabolic syndrome. Anytime in medicine we refer to something as a syndrome, it means there's a constellation of things that we see or that we can measure that sort of seem to always go together. High blood pressure, triglycerides, the HDL cholesterol being low, and impaired fasting glucose, abdominal obesity. All those things are components of what's called a metabolic syndrome. And so there's a lot of controversy even amongst professionals and what we should be doing with this. What is metabolic syndrome? Some studies have shown that the vast majority of metabolic syndrome risks that it confers is related to the glucose issue. So impaired glucose tolerance, pre-diabetes or borderline diabetes, as you may have heard it referred to, of course, is something you want to jump on. But it's one component of this. And if I had another graph, like this one, what you see is these people, you can pick them out just sitting in the weight room. They have what we call centripetal central obesity. These are the patients, I see them every day because I see a lot of patients with sleep apnea. So they have multiple features that we see clustered together, which is why we originally called it Syndrome X. Now it's called metabolic syndrome. And basically it predicts a phenotype or an appearance and associated disorders that you need to look for. So we often have to attack all of these angles if we're going to reduce the risk of heart attack and stroke in these patients. Now, I mentioned a little while ago that the best diet that I've come across is this traditional Mediterranean diet, and there is some controversy on that. There's diets like the South Beach diet, paleo diet. There's going to be a diet, it seems like, every few months. This diet is something that was described in the 1970s and 1980s, which would be very difficult to replicate with all the synthetic and processed foods that we have now. But were you able to do it? And when they followed these Greek adults, it revealed lower blood pressure when they were eating this diet as compared to other people that were not. So they said, what happens if we take 180 adults in the United States and we put them on this diet? They had this metabolic syndrome. They reduced their insulin resistance, improved features of the syndrome, and they lost weight. We improved their cholesterol lipid profiles, reduced serum markers of inflammation, one of those things. Well, we can send tests like CRP or C-reactive protein, and some patients get these things back, and you'll see on the bottom of the lab, it'll say, if your CRP level is between this and this, your risk is high, medium, and low. That's what that's talking about. It's a marker for burden of atherosclerosis, although there are other features of the tests that may predict if you send it, for example, someone with an infection, it may be elevated. So you got to be certain when you're sending it what the variable was that you're trying to measure. But if you just take patients that have high C-reactive proteins, it's a marker for burden of atherosclerosis in a way. What's this diet look like? Well, they put daily physical activity, which is an important component of this, because these people on these islands are running up and down stairs all day, and they've got narrow pathways and courtyards and so on. So they don't have a lot of ways to get around besides bicycles and walking or running. And so that forms the basis for this whole diet. They list daily, weekly, and monthly usage of these substances. And again, it looks very similar to the DASH diet, right? But there was a couple of changes there where you put in more fish, wine in moderation. Of course, they mentioned water. But alcohol itself could be a whole topic in terms of stroke risk reduction. It's actually in the guidelines that if you have 1 to 2 glasses of red wine a day, meaning a 1 to 2 glasses serving as they define it, you'll actually reduce your risk of stroke from that as well. What happens when we put women on a Mediterranean diet compared to those that are just on this Western diet, which is a typical American diet, which is really higher in red and processed meats, refined grains, sweets, and desserts? They had a higher risk of total stroke and ischemic stroke when they followed them out in the long term, which is sort of what we've all been talking about here. Such that in 2006, one of the researchers at Harvard, who does a lot of these studies and publishes a lot on this topic, put in the Public Health Nutrition statement, together with regular physical activity and not smoking, analyzing factors, they found that they could, over 80% of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes, avoid by healthy food choices consistent with this diet. So remember, at the very beginning of the lecture, I said you can cut stroke out by 80%. The vast majority of it is just these 3 things, just like it's similar to the New Zealand study, where just doing simple lifestyle changes is much more of an effective way to reduce overall burden than trying patchwork medicine with medications and things after the fact. You'd much rather never get the stent, right? The average stent, if we put it into the artery in the neck, is around $7,000 for the procedure. So most patients aren't going to just write a check for that. That's going to be something that you hope you have insurance for. And now it should be that we all have insurance, but it'd be a lot cheaper if we just avoided those things for the most part if we could in the beginning. If you take patients that are vegetarian, sometimes I've rarely been asked this question, what if I just am vegetarian? What happens there? Well, when they followed these patients, there was no lowering of their stroke mortality. They weren't measuring who was having a stroke. They were just following patients when they had a stroke, were you more likely to die or not. So it's not exactly the same data I was showing you in these other articles. But what I was saying is they really found that no matter what type of vegetarian diet you have, and when I was preparing this originally, there's actually multiple layers of vegetarianism, if you would. So different types of vegetarians. But vegetarian versus vegan, they broke it down. They really recognized that no matter what they were doing, they were not having the same degree of stroke risk reduction as, say, other diets might have. They weren't really doing anything different. But no, they're not comparing it to the different diets either. So following one type of diet didn't seem to reduce your risk of stroke just from that diet if it's vegetarian in any manifestation of it. But it may have been that we compared vegetarian diet with a typical American diet, it's better. So I wouldn't say jump off the vegetarian ship, so to speak, right away, but you need to incorporate, certain dietary factors if you're not getting them to a degree if you're going to follow that diet and you're going to do it strictly. I'm going to talk a little bit about fitness, and then we'll wrap it up here because I think I've gone an hour and a half. Most people are probably reaching the tolerance and limit of that. But the CDC said that if almost half of these adults in the United States aren't following the Surgeon General's guidelines for 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity most days of the week, I have the day that doesn't go by where there's most of my patients aren't doing this, I think. I don't see these people that are exercising all the time. They're not in my clinic. And what if we just did a few things, right? Well, CDC estimated if all physically inactive Americans became active, and it's defined by age, so you don't have to be running at age 80. You can have an activity level that's age appropriate. We'd save $77 billion in annual medical costs just from that factor alone. And that's just by following the recommended guidelines, which I'm going to get to in here in just a minute. That's not exerting a great amount of exercise. You don't have to run 5 miles a day, twice a day. You just have to exercise in an age-appropriate fashion based upon their definition. And so $77 billion, that's more than the total cost of all the stroke care combined in 2009, just from the simple factor. So diet and exercise, often overlooked, to me, it just boggles my mind. We'd save a lot of money if we do a few things. If we just got 10% of adults to just engage in a regular walking program, we would save $6 billion. So, any increment is going to be helpful. Every dollar you spend on physical activity programs for older adults with hip fractures results in a $4.50 return. So those programs that you see, rehabilitation, sometimes is sort of frowned upon. Certain physicians, they think, well, I don't know what they're going to go do there. They're just going to go home after that. But the truth is, if you have a hip fracture and you're a female in the U.S., in the next year, you're 25% likely to be dead. And over the next 2 years, it's about 75 to 80% of women that suffer a hip fracture that are elderly will have died. So having a fall and a hip fracture is not a benign thing, which is why we now have in hospitals, in my clinic, we do these gait evaluations. We put patients down at fall risk. So what are these guidelines? You can download this entire form of guidelines if you wanted to off the internet. This is just one part of it because there's not only now aerobic guidelines, but there's strengthening exercise guidelines that they put into place. So they recommend weightlifting to a degree in moderation, even for elderly. But for substantial health benefits, you need to do at least 2 hours and 30 minutes or 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity or vigorous intensity activity for less time, or an equivalent sort of mix of moderate and vigorous intensity activity. Now, what is that? Well, a person doing moderate intensity aerobic activity can talk, but they can't sing during the activity. If it's vigorous intensity, you can't say more than a few words, so that'd be someone that's not in very good shape who's trying to walk briskly. Might be someone, though, that's in very good shape who can jog next to you and they're talking in complete sentences, right? But the overall scheme of this is it doesn't take a lot of exercise. It doesn't take very intense exercise. For the most part, it just takes doing some exercise. Now, you have to get your heart rate up. So I had a woman recently come into the clinic, and I drilled her down to it. I said, listen, you say you're exercising, but 6 months ago, you came in, you weighed this amount of weight, and today it's the same. So I'm curious to know what type of exercise you're doing. Well, why don't you drill down into it? What you realize is that she has no idea what we're talking about. She's doing a little walking of her dog and things like that. So she doesn't have the education. No one's actually told her what adequate exercise is. Now, before you start jumping up and, engaging in an exercise program, realize that the American College of Sports Medicine says that if you're a man over 40 or a woman over 50, you ought to be risk stratified, which means that the physicians need to see you and do testing if you meet certain criteria to ensure you don't have already developed atherosclerotic disease. So patients can, when they increase their activity level, cause angina, which is chest pain, or may actually cause ischemia to the brain if they pick up the pace, so to speak, and there's already hardening of the arteries. Because it's like a garden hose. If you step on it, there's only two ways you're going to get that flow to go through there faster. You're either going to step off of it or you're going to turn the flow up, right? Well, if you've got problems with the pump and your heart's already inefficient, it can only turn that pump up so much until you outstrip it, which then results in ischemia, which manifests as these symptoms, which is a warning sign for either heart attack or stroke as a possible impending end result. And so this just gives you all these different things. You can get this toolkit where you can download all these things. North Carolina has its own website for this obesity epidemic that we're going through that has very similar tools. These are ubiquitous everywhere. And so with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions if I can.
Is anybody left?
Lyle,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, so, you know, as the video bears out, there's a lot of these things that, you know, we can get naturally. And anytime that you can get things naturally from a natural source and everything is much better than any of the all the processed and processes and everything where things get added that don't need to be there. And another thing on the sodium, most of your table salt is just, it's not even just the sodium anymore. But it's sodium and other fillers and stuff. It's not the salt like it needs to be, like the Himalayan pink salt. You're not going to get all the sodium in that, and that you've got all these other minerals and stuff there that it doesn't raise your blood pressure and all this other stuff. You know, it's got a lot of minerals and stuff there that we need, like the iodine and stuff. Most of your table salts and stuff don't have any nutritional value whatsoever, but it's very high in sodium, or the, you know, it's what will affect your blood pressure negatively. But just like another time we looked at where they found that sugar had more of a part to play in high blood pressure than even the sodium or the salt. So, and other people, some people, it seems like, you know, high blood pressure is their normal, and they seem to be just fine with that higher blood pressure than what, you know, the standard, or, you know, the 120 over 60, or 120 over, you know, I don't think around 70, something like that. You know, and that's the thing, is some people just naturally, whatever, for their system, tend to be able to do well with what we would call a high blood pressure. It's just normal to them, and they're doing fine. But anyway, hopefully, you know, this is taught us all something that we didn't know and something useful that we can pass on to others, as well as, you know, be aware of ourselves, especially around people that are at risk for a stroke. We can help them out if they have a stroke around us or whatever. We can recognize it and take the appropriate action. Well, again, thanks everybody for coming. Does anybody feel led to close out with a word of prayer for us?
I can, Lyle.
Okay.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for reminding us that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we'll all abide by what we have been shown this evening, we shouldn't have a stroke unless there's a natural tendency in our family line to do so. But even then, a few simple things can help us avoid a disaster. This puts a lot of responsibility back where it belongs, Lord, right on us. But that's where it really belongs. And I want to thank you, Lord, for moving Lyle to have this program tonight and for helping us to remember our own responsibility in our health care. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Yeah, again, you know, the more natural, the better. And, you know, we need to understand that there's good fats out there. There's good sources out there of things that sound bad. You know, people get scared that they're going to get fat, for example, on avocados. No, you're not going to get fat on avocados. They're actually something that help us. It helps to prevent stroke, and it's actually very, very good for us. So, and citrus, that's another thing that is really good to help prevent strokes, as well as garlic. So, regardless of whether you like it or not, I'm picking on Doc there. You know, garlic is good for you. So anyway, good night, everybody. Hope to see you in the morning and in the evening for the Lord's Supper tomorrow. And hope to see you again back here next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
Have a good evening, guys.
All right,
Bye.
you too,
Good
Garfield.
night,